Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started now. So my name's Brooke Bell, and I'm the moderator for this session. I'm also a postdoc fellow here at Friedman School. The title of this research roundtable is Tensions and Trade-Offs in Sustainable Diets Measurement. And so then just a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so please modify your name or shut off your video if you don't want to be recorded. And then after the presentation, there's going to be some time for questions, so please feel free to add those questions to the chat throughout the presentation. So today's presenters lead the Lasting Project, which takes a 4-pillar approach to the sustainability of dietary patterns by focusing on environmental, health, economic, and social outcomes. So first we have Dr. Nicole Tichner Blackstone, who's an assistant professor here at the Friedman School. She's the lead PI of the Lasting Project, as well as the co-lead on the project's AIM 3, which focuses on modeling the sustainability outcomes of shifting diets. Dr. Fang Zhang is an associate professor and the interim chair of the Division of Nutritional Epidemiology and Data Science here at the Friedman School, and she co-leads the project's AIM 3 along with Dr. Tichner Blackstone. Dr. Zhang is the Bergstrom Foundation Professor of Global Nutrition and an associate professor here at the Friedman School. Dr. Cash leads AIM 2 of the Lasting Project, which is focused on consumer and expert preferences, and he also contributes to economic analysis across the project aims. And then finally, we have Julia Matteson, who's the project manager for the Lasting Project, as well as other numerous projects here at Friedman. And she's also concurrently a master's candidate in the Food and Nutrition Policy and Programs degree program here at Friedman. And so Julia, I'll hand it off now to you for the presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Brooke, and thanks everyone for joining. As Brooke said, my name is Julia Matteson, and I am the project manager of the Lasting Project. And today we're going to discuss at a high level tensions and trade-offs in sustainability diets measurement. Before we dive into the content of our work, we first wanted to introduce who is involved in this work. So everyone you see here, as well as our valuable research assistants, are members of the Lasting Project, which stands for Leading a Sustainability Transition in Nutrition Globally. So we are an interdisciplinary team made up of epidemiologists, economists, food systems scientists, labor experts, and more. And all of this expertise really feeds into some of the innovative work we're doing on sustainable diets, which we're going to touch on today. So jumping into the content of our work, I first wanted to give a quick overview of the framework of our project and approach before diving into the specific aims and research questions that we're tackling. So as a lot of the Friedman folks on this call probably know, the food that we eat is connected to a complex supply chain with diverse components that are often very interconnected, as we see from the figure here. So food systems represent many different stakeholders involved in the production and the processing, the distribution, consumption, and the disposal of food products that originate from agriculture, from forestries, and from fisheries. And all of these processes that are part of broader economic, societal, and natural environments. So when we're thinking about food, we really need to have this systems approach in mind. But of course, we don't just focus on individual foods in this space. We look at diets as a whole. So we know that poor diets are the main contributor of a global burden of disease, which accounts for 20% of premature disease-mediated mortality worldwide. And more than 3 billion people suffer from one or more manifestations of poor nutrition, including undernutrition, overweight, obesity, and micronutrient deficiencies. But diets are much more than just health. Our food choices have major impacts on global climate, on water use, land use, biodiversity, and other key aspects of environmental sustainability. Moreover, we know that for food to get to our tables, labor and livelihoods are of really critical importance, as often work on farms and factories and fisheries and other jobs within food value chain can often be dangerous and provide low wages. And lastly, we know that the cost of food, especially healthy diets, are often an insurmountable barrier to improving diet quality. So taken together, we can really see that many different pillars of outcomes emerge when we look at food systems and diets in particular with this holistic lens. And we can also see these pillars really clearly represented in FAO's most recent definition of sustainable healthy diets that not only covers health and environment, which has historically been the focus of measurement when it comes to outcomes related to diets, but also looks at affordability, equity, and cultural acceptability. So at the Lasting Project, we're taking this 4-pillar approach to sustainable diets, and we're looking at the social, environmental, health, and economic impacts of diets. And we can get into sort of the specifics of the definitions of these pillars during the Q&A, but really broadly speaking, when we talk about health, we're really talking about outcomes related to diseases or human well-being. Related to the environment, we're looking at impacts on climate, on ecosystems, and natural resources. For the social pillar, we're focusing on the underlying conditions within and the impacts of food supply chains and the stakeholders affected by all food systems functions. So think here, workers, local communities, animals, etc. And then for the economic pillar, we're really focusing here on outcomes related to consumer affordability and access to desired foods, the cost of policy actions, and the viability of supply chains and institutions. And later in the presentation, we'll hear from Fang, who will cover sort of which outcomes in each pillar we're currently focusing on in some of our modeling work now to address all 4 of these pillars simultaneously. However, when we expand these dietary analyses to include these other considerations, such as the social and economic dimensions of diets, we tend to increase uncertainty and the likelihood of trade-offs among these different pillar outcomes. So even when we are able to model and analytically incorporate these different outcomes and metrics together to model these trade-offs, we really need to complement this work with context-specific analyses related to consumer behavior and values regarding diet sustainability issues in order to really design effective policies and programs. So with that really quick overview of our framework, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and then Sean to explain some real life sort of illustrative examples of how we see these trade-offs play out in different products and between different pillars. And then, as I mentioned, Fang will dive a little deeper into how we are modeling these trade-offs in one of the aims of our project. So with that, I will hand it over to Nicole.
Great. Thanks, Julia. So hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to share a little bit of collaborative research that folks on the Lasting Project and colleagues that we have at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab have embarked on over the past couple of years, looking at what we call the risk of forced labor embedded in food supply chains. And we're going to talk specifically in this case about fruit and vegetable consumption, because we all know that fruits and vegetables are good for us and we should probably be eating more of them. But something that we don't often talk about in this space, in the nutrition space, is really what's going on upstream in that supply chain with, for example, working conditions. So today, the specific kind of case example I'm going to give related to fruit and vegetable consumption is the risk of forced labor in those food supply chains. So starting us out, what is forced labor? Forced labor is a situation where people are coerced to work, either explicitly through the use of violence or intimidation, or by more subtle means like accumulated debt, via threatening deportation, etc. Globally, we know that agriculture as a sector has one of the highest sort of prevalences of forced labor, with almost 2 million victims estimated to be in forced labor in agriculture, fishing, and forestry globally in 2016. At the same time, we don't have good estimates of prevalence or occurrences of forced labor, like at the level of specific foods. So we'll talk about data that we've derived to try to estimate an indicator of risk, not actual prevalence or occurrences in those supply chains. And this issue is really critical, not just for food system sustainability, but for sustainability more broadly. The elimination of forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking is a critical aspect of achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So we are bringing questions around modern slavery and labor exploitation into this conversation around sustainable diets, as it's a really critical global policy question. Next slide. And to do this, we are using an approach called social life cycle assessment. So some of you may have heard of the methodology life cycle assessment. We usually use that to estimate the environmental impacts, such as water use or the carbon footprint or land use of different products or services. There's an analogous methodology called social LCA that we can use to estimate the social performance of food supply chains. So look at things like risk or different social outcomes. And this method is really unique because we can actually combine quantitative and qualitative together. So we can sort of merge a hard science approach with more of a softer social science approach together to quantitatively estimate, in our case, risk that something is that something may be occurring in a supply chain. Next slide. And one, if you could build it one, Julia, great. So I mentioned environmental LCA. So those of you, some of you may be familiar with, we could carbon footprint something or look at the climate change impact of something, and we would measure that in units of kilogram of CO2 equivalent, where we would take disparate gases like nitrous and methane, nitrous oxide and methane and carbon dioxide, and use some math to put them on an equivalent basis of CO2 equivalent. In the social LCA space, we can use an analogous approach, but with different types of data. So in social LCA, let's say we want to look, instead of at climate change, we want to look at forced labor. We can take qualitative coding of data that we have developed. Internally, we have a kind of rigorous double coding process, and we qualitatively code different data sources using the schema you see here. And then we can use some math to translate that into a unit that we call medium risk hour equivalent. It's got the same kind of concept as the CO2 equivalent, but not the same sort of causal relationship that we have with gases. Next slide. So we are estimating the risk of forced labor in fruit and vegetable supply chains in this example. And there are several steps and sources that have to come together to compute this risk. So if you imagine a strawberry that's consumed in the United States, that strawberry could come from the United States, it could come from Canada, it could come from Mexico, it could come from a number of countries around the world. And so we take data on domestic supply and imports of all of these different fruits and vegetables. We also estimate the labor intensity, the sort of working hours it takes to produce a serving of fruit or vegetables, using a couple of different data sets, which, since this is a data symposium, I'll talk briefly about. So we essentially take data from hours worked per dollar of country specific sector output. That's from input output tables, global input output tables. And we take producer prices from the FAO, and we use those two pieces of data to essentially estimate working hours for these different commodities. That working hours data is what we use to scale risk up and down quantitatively in combination with our qualitative codes. There's math behind here that I can talk through in the Q&A if folks are really interested in how we exactly do the calculations. I'm just going to go through the pieces that we bring together to do this risk assessment. So we've got supply and origin, labor intensity data that's estimated. Then we have this qualitative risk coding for each commodity country combination. So that means for strawberries in the United States, for strawberries from Mexico, for strawberries from all import countries, we've done a risk assessment where we're using data from various levels of granularity, and we're coding different data sources for very high risk, medium risk, low risk, et cetera. Then we use a social LCA approach to go from qualitative codes to quantitative scores in that unit of medium risk hour equivalent that I mentioned a minute ago. Next slide. And this again is not, this is the second time I've had issue with the slide. I don't know why it doesn't show up, but Julia, go ahead and build it, Julia. So what you're seeing, if you could see the complete figure, we're having issues with the visual. What you should see is a dot for the weighted mean for each of these fruits on the x-axis. And then around that dot, there should be a red bar that shows the distribution of risk for each item. The y-axis is in the units medium risk hours equivalent per serving. So what you're seeing here is for all of these commonly consumed fruits in the United States, what's the weighted average risk and what's the distribution or the dispersion of risk across the highest risk source and the lowest risk source, though you can't see that part because the bars aren't building in the figure. So what we found was essentially that fruits like berries and citrus and pineapple and mango and avocado showed up as higher risk fruits in our data set. And we did the same analysis for vegetables. And we also looked at these data at sort of the level of the whole fruit and vegetable supply, including waste. Next slide. And I put this out there. We're talking about this because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we know that we need to be eating more fruits and vegetables on average in North America and most places. So this graphic is from the Eat-Lancet Commission. It shows the diet gap between current intake in North America, and 100% would be the ideal intake according to the planetary health diet that the Eat-Lancet Commission developed. And so if the pie slices out of the boundary, that's overconsumption. If it's under that 100% boundary, that's underconsumption. And fruits and vegetables are the light pink, and the green pie pieces underconsumed, right, in North America and a lot of geographies around the world. So if we're really talking about getting folks to consume more fruits and vegetables, and doing it in a mass scale is kind of what would be required for folks to actually meet guidelines like this, we need to simultaneously be addressing the underlying problems of exploitation, et cetera, in these production systems. And we believe in the Lasting Project that we have an opportunity here to do both at the same time, to try to design analyses and holistic interventions to try to do both at the same time.
Before we wrap up, we kind of wanted to share a little bit more about how we plan to take this work forward in the coming months and years. So as Fang mentioned, we're working to complete this 4-pillar analysis by the end of this year, and hope to begin to assess how we can use this model to inform a wide range of policy interventions, like Fang mentioned, including taxes, subsidies, labeling, food as medicine, et cetera. But in order to do this, we need to further build out the data that we are using in the social pillar. So this includes finalizing the forced labor risk data, but also working together with other researchers in this space to think through and conceptualize what other methods and metrics need to be developed in this space to really capture social outcomes of diets. And then through another aim of our work that we didn't touch on too much today, but we can talk about a little bit more in the Q&A, we are launching an expert elicitation to understand which outcomes in each pillars experts believe are most important, and then complementing this work with consumer-facing work in order to understand sort of where the priorities align and diverge. And then lastly, connected to all of our aims is our underlying focus of how we can use this multi-pillar approach to sustainable diets to inform policies and programs. So lastly, we just wanted to acknowledge that the work of the Lasting Project is funded by an anonymous gift to the Friedman School, and the forced labor work that Nicole discussed today was done in collaboration with researchers at the University of Nottingham Rights Lab and funded both through Amazon and the University Springboard program. So thank you all so much for listening. We actually ended a few minutes early today, which is shocking. So yeah, happy to take any questions at this point.